different. Hence, it can be difficult for you to understand your teenager or young adult as a parent. Welcome to our podcast. Guided by the philosophy it takes a village to raise a child, I, Shoni, a youth pastor for over 9 years, will be interviewing various topical experts who can help parents and caregivers better understand and respond to the unique needs of Gen Z, also known as AMA 2000. Remember to follow us on our social media pages and turn on notifications in order to stay up to date with new episodes and other resources.
I think it is highly relevant, your spirituality, when you are experiencing psychological problems, challenges. However, I think we're very complex human beings and individuals. And therefore, everything that we go through in life, whether positive or negative, has a biological aspect because we live in the body. It has a psychological aspect because we have a mind. It has a neurological aspect because we have a brain. And it has a spiritual aspect because we have a soul. So even if you are experiencing a technically mental health issue per se, it can affect your viewpoint on whether you believe God is present or whether you believe God is distant. But at the same token, you could be depressed. So the two can link in and influence one another. As I get older, the more and more allergic I'm becoming to fundamentalist Christianity. This idea that God can only be seen in a very specific way. And I think that takes away our free will to define our relationship with God in a proper two-way street. My understanding of God could help you, and your understanding of God could help me. So for example, an addiction where you just can't get rid of it, or you feel I can't get rid of depression, it takes me under, is I really believe that a stepping stone to God is another believer in those situations.
Sure.
So I'm always comforted by the fact when people that are experiencing challenges, mental health challenges, and they're feeling God is far away or God has got it in for them negatively, like condemning them, that another Christian can reassure them that even though your lens is dark, you're not seeing God clearly, I can see God more clearly for you on your behalf. And I can hold you accountable to getting back on track. And I can help you to get back on track. I think it's a good thing that adolescents and children ask questions about drugs, ask questions about sex workers, ask questions about contraception, ask questions about cannabis, ask questions about boyfriend-girlfriend relationships, girlfriend-girlfriend relationships. Ask whatever you want. Because you need to allow your children to have the thinking tools. That's important. My understanding of vulnerability, and it's taken a long time, it comes from the Latin vulno, which means wound. So we all wounded. When we're in mental distress, we start to close down our view of ourselves. And that's a very dangerous place to be, is to see ourselves in only one way. Because if you think about it, it's a paradox. How can I be whole but broken? Well, you are. Because you can be both at the same time. And that is the very difficult thing about becoming an adolescent. You've got to hold your own complexity.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Podcast for Parents. We are excited today. We are joined by Dr. Christine Laidlaw, and we're going to be exploring how parents can help young people around mental health issues, but not only from an intervention point of view, but also just becoming aware of some of the mental health challenges that young people may be faced with. But before we go into all of that, I'm going to hand over to Christine for you to introduce yourself. I know you're a member here at Grace Point. You're part of the community, but for those who have not met you, if you'd care to introduce yourself.
With pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me, Heloni. So I'm Christine Laidlaw, and like Heloni said, I've been in the community since actually since I was a young child. But professionally, I'm a clinical psychologist and an associate professor at the University of South Africa. And the main campus is in Pretoria. But obviously, it's an ODL university, so it basically serves mostly South Africans, but also Africa and abroad. But my main focus is clinical psychology.
Amazing, amazing. One of the things I've always enjoyed about having conversations with you is that not only, and this is my personal opinion, not only do you give like sound input as far as your area of expertise is concerned, but even like your theology. Often when I've had conversations with you, I leave feeling like there's a beautiful balance, to be quite honest. And that's why I'm really excited for this conversation. So now just going straight into it, I was actually shocked, Christine, to find out that there are Christians who do not necessarily believe in the scientific field, or rather engaging mental health through scientific methods. There's still Christians out there who strongly believe that when people go through mental health issues, they should just pray. If not for deliverance, they should just pray for God or repent from whatever it is that they're struggling with.
Look, I think it is highly relevant, your spirituality, when you are experiencing psychological problems, challenges. However, I think we're very complex human beings and individuals. And therefore, everything that we go through in life, whether positive or negative, has a biological aspect because we live in the body. It has a psychological aspect because we have a mind. It has a neurological aspect because we have a brain. And it has a spiritual aspect because we have a soul. So even if you are experiencing a technically mental health issue per se, it can affect your viewpoint on whether you believe God is present or whether you believe God is distant. But at the same token, you could be depressed. So the two can link in and influence one another. So I don't believe in only seeing one aspect because we're highly complex. So I agree with you fully that to say that you shouldn't even consider going on medication, or you shouldn't even consider going to see a therapist or a psychologist or a counselor, you should only pray. I think, in my view, it means that you are limiting the ways in which God can work in your life.
Sure. And that's very interesting, because now I remember having a conversation with some of our young adults.
Yeah.
And one of the things we're speaking about were the intersections between feeling condemned and going through a mental health dip. When you've adamantly thought to yourself, I want to quit this particular sin, I've been trying, and you find yourself, just struggling time and again. Or at times, that particular sin might be a source of escape.
Yeah.
And so you already, engage in certain behaviors because you're already going through a mental health dip, but at the same time, you're feeling condemned. And so I would imagine that the two then, would need both spirituality and therapy.
Well, you mentioned sin, and how I see sin is you going off track.
Yeah.
So you're missing the mark in terms of what God wants for your life.
Sure.
From a Christian's perspective. Sure. And missing the mark and going off the track can have detrimental, natural consequences. Absolutely. It opens the doorway to things that God would have wanted to have protected you from. But because of free will, He respects the fact that you've chosen differently. Sure. And that's my understanding of theology. I don't believe in a coercive God. And I think that's why I was thinking about it yesterday when I was preparing and talking about these things. I'm becoming, as I get older, the more and more allergic I'm becoming to fundamentalist Christianity. Sure. This idea that God can only be seen in a very specific way. And I think that takes away our free will to define our relationship with God in a proper two-way street. My understanding of God could help you, and your understanding of God could help me. But if we're insisting on utter rigidity, it's like saying that the only way to view you is my way. And what if your your friends or your family have a different way. Just because we're seeing you differently doesn't mean that one of us is wrong.
Sure.
Yeah. And so when you say that, Christians are struggling to work out, are they condemned or are they just having a mental health dip? I think it's different lenses. You can feel condemned because you feel, where is God? Maybe God is punishing me. But that's a very Old Testament idea, that God is getting out his lightning rod and he's going to punish you. Not to say, it's interesting, I say that, but now I've just thought of a caveat that even in the New Testament, God does have a lightning bolt. but that's technical. But generally speaking, God is a God who wants to gather his children towards himself. And I think that is true of when we are feeling mentally challenged in terms of depression, anxiety, addiction. We need God more and more. And what I recommend, so for example, an addiction where you just can't get rid of it, or you feel, I can't get rid of depression, it takes me under, is I really believe that a stepping stone to God is another believer in those situations.
Sure.
So I'm always comforted by the fact when people that are experiencing challenges, mental health challenges, and they're feeling God is far away or God has got it in for them negatively, like condemning them, that another Christian can reassure them that even though your lens is dark, you're not seeing God clearly, I can see God more clearly for you on your behalf. And I can hold you accountable to getting back on track. And I can help you to get back on track. So I really believe that when people are experiencing mental health illness or challenges, that walking alongside with another believer can change their perspective.
I love that, because now we've brought in the aspects of walking alongside with another believer.
Yeah.
And I suppose that people that sometimes can fill that space are parents, caregivers, different people, different significant people in the life of teenagers, and just around then some practical ways of helping them hold that space safely. So for instance, I'll give you an example.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
As a youth pastor, often I hear that there's young people who are going through mental health challenges, but then it's like there's an either-or approach. It's like the other extreme, which then they would say, no, because so-and-so is going through a mental health issue, we're going to keep them away from church for some time. It feels like parents so often have to choose between church, religion, or therapy. And what are some practical ways in which we can hold both? Because I think you've given us some insights as to why the different lenses are important.
Well, I think we'd have to unpack what is the parents' perception of church.
Sure.
Because if the parents see church as a negative peer group, or one or two individuals in the church kind of environments, they might attribute that to everybody in the congregation.
Sure.
Or they might be saying, no, there's only one way to view this is medical and therefore not spiritual. Look, it depends what the perception of the parents is of the church that the adolescent is attending. I think it's difficult for parents and teenagers because even on a normal situation, so in other words, no distress, right?
Sure.
Or we always have a little bit of distress, but if an adolescent is living their life and they're not having a mental health challenge that is noticeable or is clear, they're just living their normal day-to-day life. Even then, parents are going to battle with it's a process. It's a developmental, natural process that your child who is getting older is going to have to do things differently to you in order to define themselves, in order to leave the nest, right?
Sure.
And to survive in the big world out there. And part of their differentiation, so to to push themselves out of the nest,
Sure.
they need another place to hold them. And that place could be church, it could be a school, peer group, it could be anything. I don't necessarily think it's good to keep children isolated. I think it is good to say to your child, no, go to church, go to that church, go to whatever church you want to go to whatever school you want to go to. Like if they're saying they're not happy at another school, obviously you have to check that out, because I think all children should be in school.
Sure.
But the point is this idea that parents must overprotect children. That is not a good idea. I think what parents need to do is they need to pay attention to the feedback that comes from these different places outside of the home,
Sure.
so that they can help their children manage complexity. So these are the positives of church. These are the negatives. That aspect of church you need to be careful of. This
Sure.
aspect of church, you know. So my big thing, and this is the gift of the Holy Spirit, is discernment. So we as parents and as adults that look after children in whatever capacity, whether you're a teacher, a therapist, a parent, a caregiver, a headmaster, whatever your role as an adult looking out for children, we can't overprotect them and have all the discernment in our own head, right? All
Sure.
the rules in our own head, and we're making the decisions and we're calling the shots. You may do that for a 2-year-old because they can't manage the world. But your child at the age of 18 or 19, depending on, when you decide to do tertiary education or to leave the family home, is you need to know that your child can have these skills. So that if you're not there, they can think like you or similarly to you, or at least argue the point. So it's a journey from when your child is about, even little, the why, daddy, why, mommy, why is this like this? Why does the caterpillar crawl like this? Why does the caterpillar turn into a butterfly? Even when they're little, the curiosity is important. The mistake in parenting is shutting down questions in children and adolescents. So, I've mentioned it before. I think it's a good thing that adolescents and children ask questions about
Absolutely.
drugs,
Absolutely.
ask questions about sex workers, ask questions about contraception, ask questions about cannabis, ask questions about boyfriend-girlfriend relationships, girlfriend-girlfriend relationships. Ask whatever you want.
Sure.
Because you need to allow your children to have the thinking tools. That's important. So I don't think children should be shut down and kept away from difficult places or complex places.
I love that. I really like that, Christine, allowing your kids to actually go into difficult spaces and allowing them, or rather journeying with them and empowering them to learn how to survive in those spaces, actually how to thrive, in those particular spaces.
And what's important there, sorry, I just want to give you another tip.
Sure.
It's not instant. It's not one day my child didn't know how to do it and the next day they're thriving. You set up a feedback process, or what Leo Vygotsky, very good Russian psychologist, he developed this idea called scaffolding. So he said that a child learns step by step, like, the scaffold that holds up a building, and then as it gets built, you remove the scaffolding, and then it stands on its own.
Sure,
right?
sure.
So exactly like scaffolding when you see them building a building. Now, in order for a child to develop, they need a step-by-step process. So the easiest way to remember it is a child doesn't learn to swim in a day.
Sure.
A child actually learns to swim, here's a little tip, by learning to blow bubbles first. And I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Because they've got to feel super confident with water.
Okay.
So you start very incremental.
Okay.
Incremental. You're like, what is blowing bubbles, got to do with swimming? It's the confidence around water.
Okay.
And it's so incremental, the child doesn't even know that it's going to end up with them being submerged in water. But the perception that I can control water or at least manage it is important.
Okay.
Because you actually truly can't manage water. But you need the confidence to believe how to navigate it. Yeah. So what I'm saying, and it's even true if you think of your driver's license.
Sure.
You can read that K53 as many times as you want. Am I right? And I'm sure many of the young people listening to this will identify. You can read that book 100 times. You can identify everything and how to do the traffic circle and whatever. But until you get in that car, you really don't know if you really know.
True.
Yeah, and it's the same with the Christian life. A parent can have a list of rules and say, I expect you to do this. But until you're living your day-to-day reality, you don't know the applicability of that rule.
I love that, Christine. But then now, I suppose then sometimes what I often see or rather think might be a challenge, I see with other relationships I've observed. You find that now Gen Zs, just before the recording, you and I were speaking about it, that they're very outspoken about their emotional well-being, around mental health issues and all of that. But their parents come from a different generation.
Yeah.
Their parents are most likely to be Gen Xers, and if they had kids at a late age, it would be boomers. But they still stigmatize mental health. For some parents, it's still a big thing. It's still something that they hide. I know of families where teenagers have attempted suicide, and it remains a secret, a family secret, which does not really help, in my view, unqualified view, to create a safe space for healing, because you want to, not wear your scars for everyone to see, but you want to be able to be vulnerable where you feel it's a safe space.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think first of all, I think if I can keep it straightforward, and if anything from this podcast that we're having is the number one thing that I find myself reiterating to myself as a person and a professional and my clients, is just around this idea that is so complicated to deliver to oneself, to actually agree with it.
Sure.
And that is that vulnerability does not equal weakness.
Absolutely. Vulnerability does not equal weakness.
Yeah. And I promise you, I've spent weeks and months just reminding myself, who knows it from the textbooks, but has to work it out in her life every day. Vulnerability does not equal weakness. So literally at home, you can get a piece of paper and you can write the word vulnerability, a little equal sign, put a cross through the equal sign,
I love that.
write weakness, and say to yourself, I've got to begin to understand this. Because my understanding of vulnerability, and it's taken a long time, it comes from the Latin vulno, which means wound.
Okay.
So we all wounded. And it's interesting, we've got Easter coming up.
Sure.
And Christ was wounded on the cross. And I was reading somewhere the other day, I don't know where, so it's not my own thought. Okay.
Disclaimer.
Yeah, I don't know where I read it, but whoever said it recently, I give you all the credit. But it originally was from the Bible anyway. But the most important thing for Thomas was to see the scars of Jesus, to know that it was the living Christ, the resurrected Christ. I actually think it was from this book called The Scars That Shaped Me. And that it was written by a Christian. I must just remember her name. But the point I'm making is that wounds are part of being human. That's another thing.
That. Yeah.
And until we help our children to absorb, and our cousins and our nieces and whoever, until we give permission to ourselves and the people we love and the people we don't even like, permission to this idea that I have to agree that I'm human.
Sure.
And if I agree I'm human, then that means I will be wounded in this life. And because I'm wounded doesn't mean I'm broken. And that comes from my own therapist. That's not mine.
Sure. Because I'm wounded, but it does not mean that I'm broken.
Yes. And, or she put it another way, is because you're broken doesn't mean you aren't whole.
Sure. Sure.
And I think we tend to say it's either or, like you said.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. When we're in mental distress, we start to close down our view of ourselves. And that's a very dangerous place to be, is to see ourselves in only one way.
Sure.
Because if you think about it, it's a paradox.
Okay.
How can I be whole but broken? Well, you are. Because you can be both at the same time.
Sure.
And that is the very difficult thing about becoming an adolescent. Is you've got to hold your own complexity. You can't oversimplify things anymore.
And then what becomes the role of parents in all of that, especially if they're still stigmatizing mental health?
I think the important thing is for parents to sit with themselves and to say, or go to therapy. I'm a big fan of therapy.
Sure.
Right? I think you can parent very well, good enough. No one's perfect. I think
Sure.
you can parent good enough if you have internalized a protective, emotive, emotional laden understanding of how to protect your vulnerable inner child. So your perception of yourself as a child, which is still living inside of you, needs to be parented every day. And that's a very prominent thought across the schools of psychology. And if we were to have a Bible study, not that we are, but it's an interesting one to do for yourself as a parent,
Sure.
right? And even important for adolescents to do is to say, let me read my Bible over time and find all the parenting images that I resonate with in the Bible. And it's important that, I always say, it's important that it resonates with you down to your skin.
Sure.
And it feels real to you. In other words, almost like you can feel it on your skin. Because then the Bible is living inside of you.
Sure.
And so I don't believe people should just pick a verse because somebody told them it's a good verse. It's a living word, so it needs to make sense to you.
Today.
Yeah.
I love that, Christine, because I can tell you now, I already have a Bible lesson from what you've shared today. I'm really thinking post-Easter, post-resurrection, when Jesus shows Thomas his scars, that he's wounded, but it does not mean that he's not the resurrected Lord.
Yes.
Though wounded, So there we go. I've got a lesson from you. Thank you for that.
There are rules.
There actually are rules.
The rule is you can say whatever you want. And the reality is you can't. You can and you can't. It's a bit of a paradox. Go ahead and say what you want, but there will be a natural consequence.
Sure.
So you could be vilified. You could be in trouble with the law. You could be applauded to such an extent that you start to think that acquaintances are your friends.
Sure.
So then
sure.
you're open to exploitation. Your self-esteem, right? Or even deeper than your self-esteem, your self-worth can become linked to very superficial ideas of what it means to be loved.
Christine, that is a big one. I'm actually going to park the question I had for you, but that is a big one, because now, how do parents help create systems for their children to live a normal life, whatever normal is, but be on social media, however, without social media triggering their mental health?